a written blog that I do put out called The World Tomorrow. It's theworldtomorrow.ca, I believe. And I was talking pretty much of why it is so important in the 21st century, perhaps even more so for Christians, to take note and to remember what are the lessons of Hanukkah. We are right in the middle of Hanukkah right now, which maybe sounds strange, for somebody who is a Christian to talk about it. But Hanukkah, actually, you can find what it talks about, and as I mentioned very clearly in my blog, and in the previous few messages I've been talking about, the messages are very applicable in our time. I want us to focus on something today, because the Bible has quite a few lessons and a few examples. Among the story of the people of God, things have not always been good. There's sometimes been when the wicked rise to power, and the people of God have to know what happens. What is the story of, and what do we do during periods like that? It is an important lesson that is in the scriptures, and we're going to look at it. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 12. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 12. I'm going to start here in citing, of course, in the Amplified Bible version. We'll open this up, verse 12. When the righteous triumph, there is great glory and celebration. Now, I want to talk a little bit from the comment that Matthew Poole made on this, and we'll talk a little bit more about who is Matthew Poole anyways. But when the righteous triumph, there is great glory and celebration. Yes, righteous men do rejoice when they are encouraged and promoted to places of trust and power, Poole wrote. There is great glory in that commonwealth. The state of the kingdom is honorable and comfortable and safe, so good men can show their faces with courage and confidence. But then there's a second part of this Proverbs. Like most Proverbs, you start with a proposition and then you have a follow-through to think about. It's something to consider. A proverb is a teaching example, something we can keep in mind. Yes, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory and celebration. But, on the other hand, when the wicked rise to prominence, that's the way the Amplified puts it, men hide themselves. Or in some versions you'll say, or a man is hidden. Because it's literally what the Hebrew says. A man is sought for. They hide themselves. Why? They hide themselves for fear. And they must be sought for in order to be found. Matthew Poole comments on this second part of the of this Proverb 28, verse 12. He says, when the wicked rise, that is, are advanced to honor and authority, a man is hidden. The state of that nation is so shameful and dangerous that wise and good men, who are only worthy of the name of men, withdraw themselves or run into quarters and obscure places, partly out of grief and shame to behold the wickedness which is publicly and impudently committed, and partly to avoid the rage and injuries of wicked oppressors, and even the judgments of God which calmly follow such persons and their confederates in sin. Or, as others, both ancient and later interpreters render it, a man is sought out, sober and good men, who had retired themselves, that is, they had hid themselves, they had taken themselves out of the stream of public life, are searched for and brought forth like sheep to the slaughter, as being most suspected and hated and feared by bloody tyrants. William Poole, he lived 1624 to 1679. He lived during one of the most turbulent periods of time in, the early modern English history. He was what we call an English non-conformist theologian. He was a leader of this movement, that was these were people who didn't feel the Church of England was living according to the Scriptures, because you have to remember, much of this took place in the environment of the English Reformation, and then the whole story that came about. William Poole, he rose to prominence during this period of time of when English history there was all this back and forth between the different religious groups and their perspectives. And Poole was a non-conformist. He rose to prominence during the time when Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth was in power during the 1640s and 1650s. They had cut off King Charles I's head, because Charles was trying to say that he was the absolute monarch and he didn't have to listen to the people and he didn't have to respect their traditional freedoms and all these other things. Well, Poole, was a young man, and he came to prominence. He rose up. I think he went to Cambridge. He was not a schlump by any means, and he had achieved quite a bit of prominence in the religious side of the Commonwealth, because he was a non-conformist. He was somebody who looked at the Scriptures and said, "Oh, well, this is what the Scriptures say. This is what we ought to do," as opposed to just following the tradition that had been originally handed down through the Roman Church. So he would eventually also, Matthew Poole would become quite well known as a biblical commentator. I did cite some of his commentaries already, but after the Restoration, after the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell petered out and collapsed, I guess one of the major problems was that Oliver Cromwell's sons who followed him weren't such good leaders. They were, I guess they were corrupt and incompetent from that standpoint. But eventually the English people said, well, we need the monarchy back. And after the restoration of Charles II to the English monarchy, in a sermon, Poole got up in a sermon on August 26, 1660, before the Lord Mayor of London, because, of course, and he was speaking at St. Paul's Cathedral, which was the main church there in London. So Poole was there, and he was going to give the sermon for the day, and the Lord Mayor, who would have been an appointee of Charles II, was sitting there in the pews listening to every word. Anyways, Poole got up there and made the case for simplicity in public worship. He was making the case that, we shouldn't go back to all the traditions of the Anglican High Church. We shouldn't stay and keep our worship according to the Scriptures. He was a non-conformist. He was somebody who said, we need to take, a sola scriptura instead of adding all these other things. Well, he made that case before Charles II's hand-picked mayor of the city of London for simplicity in public worship. This is the way it describes it. However, within 2 years, the Parliament passed what was called the Uniformity Act of 1662. This Uniformity Act said, there's only one way we're going to do it, and we're going to do it the High Church Anglican Church way. And that's the only way we're going to do it. Everybody has to do that. Poole had, he resigned as soon as it was passed. He resigned from his prominent church post and his well-paying salaried day job. Poole was willing, and he did. He lowered his standard of living in order to get by on what his inheritance that he'd received from his father, £100 a year, which even at that time was a significant amount of money, but it wasn't going to be living too high. I mean, he would be able to get by, somewhat comfortably, but he resigned ahead of time rather than being pushed, out of the job. He knew what was coming. He saw what was coming. And he decided, okay, I'm not going to be an immediate target. I am going to be a little proactive because I know they're going to get rid of me. So he resigned. Oftentimes God's people, sometimes we think that, God seems to ignore the wrongs and all what's going on, but God is not unaware. But that's, there are many of God's people sometimes said when bad things are happening, and maybe Matthew Poole was thinking the same thing at that point in time, that the whole effort of the Puritans and the non-conformists to reform the Christian church, from many of its, tradition of men, in which God says they worship him in vain. Anyways, Job himself thought, and he answered when he was going through all of his troubles, he said in Job chapter 24 and verse 1, citing the Amplified Bible version, "Why does the Almighty not set seasons for judgment?" Why can't I get something regular? Why don't I get a regular appearance before God's whole court that we take care of these problems in due order? Why do those who know him not see his days for punishment of the wicked? Some of these wicked, they remove the landmarks. They violently seize and pasture flocks, appropriating land and flocks openly. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. In other words, they're taking away their means of livelihood. Donkeys in the ancient world of Job were like pickup trucks. It's how you moved around cargo and small amounts of this, is that, and the other. But the wicked would drive away the donkeys of orphans. They take a widow's ox for a pledge. A widow's ox, okay, she needs money. They say, okay, to give you this loan, we want your ox. That's like saying, we want your tractor. That means you can't really plow your field and sow grain and have a decent way of supporting yourself. They're taking away the means of your making your livelihood. They take away your job. They were cancel culturing her, and from that aspect in modern speak. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. They crowd the needy off the road. Then the comment that Job said, the poor of the land all hide themselves. Because they're trying to fly under the radar of those who were oppressing them, those who, had the power to do whatever they wanted to do and take advantage of them. After he was, felt compelled to be proactive to give up his officially licensed ministerial credentials and his job, Matthew Poole, however, he would occasionally preach in public. He might be invited. He might have a friend and say, hey, come preach the sermon this week. And he printed some doctrinal tracts. However, he made no attempt that could be seen by those who were carefully watching his every move. He made no attempt to gather a non-conforming congregation or set up an opposition to the Church of England officials and authorities. He wasn't going to visibly stir up opposition, which might create big problems for himself. And what he did do, however, even though he did set up his own church, from this aspect, we're not going to put up with this, he didn't quite do it that way. What he did was maintain an extensive informal network of friends who were mostly non-conformists of similar mindset as he did, and with their help, Poole was able to play a leading role in setting up a low-profile non-conformist ministry and a day school, to teach people and to teach them according to the scriptures in, of all interesting places, Tunbridge Wells in Kent. I thought that was interesting because I used to preach in Tunbridge Wells a few years ago when I was teaching in England, and my family, when we were over there at that point in time, we attended services in Tunbridge Wells. And again with the Church of God, which is a non-conforming church according to the Church of England. I remember when somebody had asked you, because I had to teach religious studies. That's one of the things I taught in the public schools was religious studies. I had all the background you could possibly ask for that. And anyways, I would teach, and they said, they'd say, hey, Jeff, hey, what are you? I said, well, and when they would ask me, the principal, what kind of religion are you, type of thing, I said, because I knew enough of my history, I said, I'm a non-conformist. And that answered everything they wanted to know. As far as that, they didn't expect to see me at the Anglican church service that weekend, okay, from that standpoint. Anyways, Because of his former high profile, in the established church during the Cromwell period and as a leader among the non-conformists, Matthew Poole's opinion was solicited, and his nonconformist friends asked him to do something when Charles II, who is in England, he's head of the English church. Just remember, like Henry VIII was head, he kicked out the Pope's representatives and did all these things and made himself head of the church and said the Bishop of Archbishop of Canterbury to be his right-hand man over the church affairs. But anyways, Charles II, who was then restored to power and head of the Anglican high church, hierarchy, he, however, was also king of all the English people, and he knew there were a great deal of non-conformists and others who weren't always happy with the Anglican hierarchy. So he made a cautious and moderate effort to try to bring peace and solidarity to his kingdom. So he issued an indulgence on March 15th, 1672, that would allow people, the indulgence would extend religious liberty to Protestant nonconformists as well as Roman Catholics in his realm. And as a result of that, Poole, along with several other nonconformist leaders, and I don't know about Catholics, but anyways, they offered and they publicly issued a proclamation of a cautious and moderate thanksgiving for the king's consideration of his worthy subjects type of thing. And this was a little expression of, hey, we don't think you're the devil incarnate. We'll work with you, king. And the king was pleased enough with Poole's response and some of the other nonconformist leaders who issued for their people a cautious and moderate thanksgiving for the king that he actually paid him £50, which at that point in time, it's half the money he would live on a year from that standpoint. So it was a big deal. I suppose he didn't expect that the king would reward him like that, but the king was appreciative of enough. I'm mentioning it to show how important this was at that point in time, and because he was walking a fine line of trying not to be viewed as a traitor, but he wasn't going to sacrifice his principles either. But if he could say something nice about the king, he would say something nice about the king. Hey, this is good, because what this declaration of indulgence was that you didn't have to go sit in Anglican church services every Sunday, or you would get fined, or you would get whipped, or you'd get thrown into prison. Okay, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. But this royal issue, this issue of indulgence, however, was highly controversial, especially among the worthies of the high church establishment there in England. They didn't like it. So that actually within a year, they had what they call the 1673 Cavalier Parliament. In other words, they had kicked out all the Puritans and nonconformists and whatever, and you had to be a real loyal subject to the king attending the Anglican church. Anyways, they compelled Charles II. They went to the king, they all got together and showed up at his palace and said, "Oh, king, this isn't a good idea. We all feel this is a terrible idea," and they compelled him to withdraw the declaration. And in his place, instead, they issued what was the first of the Test Acts in 1673, which said that if you were going to have any public office, and that included all church offices, the army, the navy, the bureaucracy, whatever official things in municipal government, whatever office you wanted, you had to first say, of course, they hit the Catholics, you don't believe in the transubstantiation, the Catholic, the whole idea of their communion, okay, and that they do in their masses, and you had to attend the established high church service and profess your loyalty to it. And if you didn't do that, hey, you can't be in any sort of government service any way and whatsoever. That was 1673. And that wasn't revoked until the middle 1800s. For all that period of time, if you were a non-conformist, my ancestors in the faith, from this standpoint, you were a second-class citizen. Most definitely, you didn't have all your civil rights. You didn't from that standpoint. And you could be mistreated and all these other things, which, of course, forced, if you were in the church at that point in time, well, government service or becoming an officer in the Army or Navy, just being a little schwabby. They might drag you, and they might grab you, by the collar and throw you into their Navy or their Army and make you cannon fodder. They were always willing to do that. Didn't matter what you believed, from that standpoint. But if you were going to be anything in the establishment whatsoever, you had to pass the test acts, okay, officially. And if not, you were second class. And there were a whole bunch of things you couldn't do in your society, which forced most of you either had to make things with your hands, an artisan or a craftsman, or you were a merchant, or you were a farmer, a lowly farmer, these sorts of things. You certainly could never participate in government or run as a politician for anything, from that standpoint. But this is nothing new from that standpoint. God's people have always faced it. There have been acts that governments have come up with from time to time that made life difficult. I mean, the whole story we don't normally recount at this time of year of Esther and Purim and Esther 4:3, when Haman came up with this thing that he wanted, we're going to kill all the Jews and we're going to steal all their property, and anybody who wants to get in on this just has to join my forces, in every province where the king's command and decree arrived. That was Haman's decree and Haman's command, because he used the king's seal ring to accomplish that. There was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And you can read, of course, in the story of Esther, is eventually they prevailed. God did give them deliverance and space and delivered them from their enemies. Anyways, after Matthew Poole had done his cautious and moderate thanksgiving for Charles' first effort at religious tolerance, from the period of time, and the king's, grateful for the king's willingness to show them a little indulgence because they were politically out of favor. Remember, Matthew Poole had been, allied with, Oliver Cromwell and his Commonwealth, which was anathema to the royalists once the Restoration occurred in 1616. Anyways, sometimes following that, there was a fellow, if you want to put it this way, he was sort of on the right. His name was Titus Oates. This Titus Oates is known and remembered in history as being a prodigious liar, and one of the most renowned early radical Protestant conspiracy theorists of the time. And he, in one of his things, because he came up with this whole thing because he was concerned the Catholics might get back in power, because he saw the royalists all around the court around Charles II, and he was concerned the Catholics were getting the upper hand, because indeed the successor to Charles II would be James II, and he had very strong Catholic sympathies. Anyways, he was trying to provoke some of the Anglicans into doing something about this, and he came up with this story about how they were trying to kill Charles II, and anybody who stood against him. The Catholics were the Papists were, I think they used the word, the Papists were trying to do this. And he said that Poole, that Matthew Poole was marked out for assassination, among all the other. He had this list of stuff that he was doing. And there were people, by the way, who died because of Oates' accusation, because they hauled him in. They were scared, from that standpoint. They listened to that, and they thought, wow, this is Poole had after all had written a tract on the nullity of the Romanish faith, so he took a little evidence and he embellished it. But when all this came out, of course, it was the big social media hit of the day. Poole, however, he gave some credit to Oates' conspiracy theory, because one day in returning home with a friend, he'd had a big scare. Somebody had tried to attack him. And he felt generally threatened, and Poole, promptly left England in 1678 and settled in Amsterdam, where he felt more free, which is not surprising in some ways. I mean, he was just following the track of, the people who went on the Mayflower a generation or two before, 50 years or so before. He felt that he was safer in Amsterdam, but he died there in exile about a year later. Proverbs 29 and verse 16. I'll cite this in the Messenger, Peterson's Messenger paraphrase. When degenerates take charge, crime runs wild, but the righteous will eventually observe their collapse. That's sort of like the normal order of things, but there is a season, there is a time for this. It seems to go in waves, if you want to say, or it repeats itself. History has its way of repeating itself. And I'm not sure when the wicked come to power. This was a story that was quite often in the story of Israel. If we go to 1 Kings chapter 16. 1 Kings chapter 16, we're going to hear the story of Ahab and Elijah. You might not know it. Ahab, anyways, he's the son of Omri. By the way, this Ahab is, of course, is a historical figure. His father and whatever's mentioned in the Assyrian archives that have been recovered. I mean, this isn't fairy tale stuff. It was actual things that happened. 1 Kings chapter 16, we'll start with verse 29. I'm going to stay with because I like it. It gives a little more lively Peterson's message paraphrase. Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah. Okay, we're putting it in time frame. Ahab, son of Omri, was king over Israel for 22 years. He ruled from Samaria, today's West Bank. Ahab, son of Omri, did even more open evil before God than anyone yet. A new champion in evil. It wasn't enough for him to copy the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had changed God's feast from being in the 9th month to the 10th month, and he had set up places of worship other than Jerusalem, and he'd introduced a certain amount of idolatry and things like this. No, Ahab, he went out first by marrying Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, the Phoenicians, pagan people just to the north in what is now Lebanon. And then by serving and worshiping the god Baal. He built a temple for Baal in Samaria. So in the capital city of the nation, he built a big temple to Baal, a pagan, a false god, from the Israelite standpoint, in their traditional religion. And then furnished it with an altar for Baal. Worse, he went on and built a shrine to the sacred whore Asherah. And he made the God of Israel angrier than all the previous kings of Israel put together. I love it. One of the other versions, but he sold himself to do evil. Ahab was a real, piece of work from God's perspective. Let's go to 1 Kings 17, verse 1. And then this happened. Oh, there's always and then this happens in the scripture, when evil was waxing strong. And then this happened. Elijah the Tishbite from among the settlers of Gilead. Okay, he wasn't necessarily a big shot. He was, but God had picked him out. From God's standpoint, he was somebody, he said, I like this Elijah guy. He sent Elijah to confront Ahab. And Elijah said, as surely as God lives, the God of Israel, before whom I stand in obedient service, the next years are going to see a total drought, not a drop of dew or rain unless I say otherwise. In an agricultural society, this was terrible, terrible news. Elijah was saying to Ahab, okay, you've got power, you've got all the stuff, but I'm going to make your life hell. Because either you're going to have a drought, and this is good. Even today, hey, if we had a drought here in North America and we dried up the plains and there's no water, California, in Oregon and Washington will burn. There'll be no grain harvested. What do you think that's going to do to the country? If that were to happen? it'd be terrible news. And I mean, it's not just terrible news this wasn't just terrible news for Ahab, but it was everybody in the place was going to suffer. But Ahab didn't get to where he was and be able to build a temple of Baal and altars and worship places to the whore Asherah, except that he had some cooperation among a certain portion of the population. Anyways, after Elijah the Tishbite gave Ahab that this is going to happen. Okay, we're going to have a drought, and boy, it is going to be a big one. Verse 2, God then told Elijah, okay, you speak truth to power, then what happens? God already knew the nature of Ahab and his wife Jezebel, okay? And God then told Elijah, you spoke truth to power? Get out of here and fast. Head east and hide out in the Kerith ravine on the other side of the Jordan River. You can drink fresh water from the brook. I've ordered the ravens to feed you. Okay, he's got the ravens. They're going to, this is interesting. Elijah obeyed God's orders, and he went and camped in the Kerith Canyon and on the other side of Jordan. And sure enough, so he went out into the boonies, you might put it that. He went out into the bush. Ravens brought him his meals, both breakfast and supper, and he drank from the brook. Eventually, the brook, however, dried up because of the drought, and God spoke to him, get up and go to Zarephath in Sidon and live there. So you're in exile. You're going to live in a pagan country, but it's out of the jurisdiction of Ahab. It's not within the borders of Israel, the northern 10 tribes. I've instructed a woman who lives there, a widow, to feed you. You can go on and read the whole story, but let's just pop down to 1 Kings chapter 18 and pick the story up. And a long time passed. It seemed like a long time. After all, he had said 3.5 years, and so day by day, a long time passed, and God's word came to Elijah. And by the way, the drought was a regional drought. It even affected the people up in Phoenicia and Sidon where he went. The drought was now in its 3rd year, and the message, Elijah got a message from God. It said, go and present yourself to Ahab. I'm about to make it rain on the country. Because God was concerned about his people. Now, he made his point from this standpoint. And Elijah sent out to present himself to Ahab. So he was going to have to, God had told him, he'd given him a commission. When you're a prophet, you're oftentimes between a rock and a hard spot, from this standpoint. I mean, Elijah certainly knew it was dangerous to go in there after, confronting the king, hiding out for 3 years, the country going through this drought. But anyways, goes on. The drought in Samaria at that time was most severe. And it breaks into what was going on at that moment. Ahab had called for Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace, one of the government officials who served Ahab. Obadiah, however, feared God, the God of the Bible. He was very devout. Earlier, when Jezebel had tried to kill off all the prophets of God, a bunch of preachers that were still preaching, the gospel from the standpoint of the Old Covenant and the Word of God. When she had tried to kill off the prophets of God, Obadiah had hidden away 100 of them in 2 caves, 50 in a cave, and then supplied them with food and water. So he knew because of his faith, he took enormous risks to hiding some of God's people from those who would kill him. See, they went into hiding because they had to, because they were, there was this persecution against any who were preaching the truth. Verse 5, Ahab ordered Obadiah, go through the country, locate every spring and every stream. Let's see if we can find enough grass to keep our horses and mules from dying. So they divided the country between them for the search. Ahab went one way and Obadiah the other. Obadiah went his way, and suddenly there he was, Elijah! Obadiah fell on his knees, bowing in reverence, and exclaimed, is it really you, my master Elijah? Yes, said Elijah, the real me. Now go and tell your boss, I've seen Elijah. And Obadiah said, but what have I done to deserve this? Ahab will kill me. As surely as your God lives, there isn't a country or kingdom where my master hasn't sent out search parties looking for you. And they probably took along big bags of money, say, you want to turn in Elijah? I got this big bag of money for you, O king of Egypt, or wherever it might have been. See, they went to search out Elijah, but God hid him. God hid him, so they hadn't been able to find him. And this is why Obadiah says now, he said, go tell Elijah, Elijah saying to Obadiah, go tell Ahab, your master, I'm here, I want to see him. There isn't a country or kingdom where my master hasn't sent out search parties looking for you. And if they said, we can't find him, we've looked high and low, he would make that country or kingdom swear that you were not to be found. And now you're telling me, go and tell your master, Elijah's found. The minute I leave you, the Spirit of God will whisk you away to who knows where. Then when I report to Ahab, you'll have disappeared, and Ahab will kill me. He knew his boss. He had a hard boss. And I've served God devoutly since I was a boy. Hasn't anyone told you what I did when Jezebel was out to kill the prophets of God? How I risked my life by hiding 100 of them, 50 to a cave, and made sure they got food and water? And now you're telling me to draw attention to myself by announcing to my master, Elijah's been found? Why, he'll kill me for sure. I mean, this was the situation. He knew his boss. He knew the nature of the man. Verse 15, and Elijah said, as surely as God of the angel armies live, the Lord of hosts, and before whom I take my stand, I'll meet with your master face to face this very day. So Obadiah went straight to Ahab and told him, and Ahab went out to meet Elijah. The moment Ahab saw Elijah, he said, so it's you, old troublemaker. It's not I who have caused trouble in Israel, said Elijah, but you and your government. You've dumped God's ways and commands and run off after the local gods, the Baals. Here's what I want you to do. Notice, this is quite the meeting, and Elijah is taking charge from this standpoint. Assemble everyone in Israel at Mount Carmel. Make sure the special pets of Jezebel, the 450 prophets of the local gods, the Baals, and the 400 prophets of the whore goddess Asherah are there. So Ahab summoned everyone in Israel, particularly the prophets, to Mount Carmel. It's maybe a measure of the desperation Ahab felt, that he didn't just order Elijah killed at that moment, because he'd looked for him all this time. And he realizes we're going to have a little bit of a contest here. There's something going on. Verse 21, and Elijah challenged the people. So he assembled, everyone in Israel, particularly the prophets, to Mount Carmel. So he got them all up there. And he challenged the people, how long are you going to sit on the fence? Make up your minds. If God is the real God, follow him. If it's Baal, follow him. Make up your minds. And nobody said a word. Nobody made a move. Then Elijah said, I'm the only prophet of God left in Israel. Okay, he was exaggerating at this point because Obadiah had just told him, that he'd saved 100. So, okay, Elijah maybe at this point, he's just exaggerating for effect, perhaps. There are 450 prophets of Baal. Let the Baal prophets bring up 2 oxen. Let them pick one, butcher it, and lay it out on the altar on firewood. But don't ignite it. Don't set fire to the wood. I'll take the other oxen, cut it up. So you get first choice. Okay, you got this. It's it's kind of like an ancient world. You do with a bat, and you go up, and who gets the top, or face off with a hockey puck. Where you want to get it. So okay, we got 2 oxen. You got all the team of Baal and Asherah over here. They got all this enormous large team, and here's just me. Okay, but you get first choice. You can take whichever oxen you want. I'll take the other ox, cut it up, and lay it on the wood. But neither will I light the fire. Then you pray to your gods, and I'll pray to God. My God, the God of the Bible. The God who answers with fire will prove to be, in fact, the real God, not the false God. All the people agreed. Good plan. Let's do it. Hey, this is good. Can you, hey, let's pull up some seats here, make ourselves comfortable. This is going to be a great little spectacle. Remember, butchering a cow and doing all this takes a little bit of time. Elijah told the Baal prophets, choose your ox and prepare it. You go first. You're the majority. Then pray to your God, but don't light the fire. And we've got all these people looking, so you can't cheat. You can't cheat. Okay, we got too many observers here at this contest. You can't cheat. So they took the oxen he had given them and prepared it for the altar and prayed to Baal. They prayed all morning long. Oh, Baal, answer us. But nothing happened, not so much as a whisper of breeze. Desperate, they jumped and stomped on the altar they had made. By noon, Elijah had started making fun of them, taunting them. Call a little louder. He is a god after all. Maybe he's off meditating some way or another. Or maybe he's gotten involved in a project. Or maybe he's on vacation. You don't suppose he's overslept, do you? And needs to be waked up. They prayed louder and louder, cutting themselves with swords and knives in ritual common to them until they were covered with blood. Sort of like what the Shiites do, in one of their celebrations where they whip themselves and cut themselves and they're all bloody and stuff. You still see this sort of thing going on. Verse 29, this went on till well past noon. They used every religious trick and strategy they knew to make something happen on the altar, but nothing happened. Not so much as a whisper, not a flicker of response. Verse 30, then Elisha told the people, enough of that. It's my turn. Gather around. And they gathered. He then put the altar back together, an altar for God that had been there. It was now in ruins. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, the same Jacob to whom God had said, from now on, your name is Israel. He built the stones into an altar in honor of the Bible's God, the God of Israel. Then Elijah dug a fairly wide trench around the altar. He laid firewood on the altar, cut up the ox, put it on the wood, and said, fill 4 buckets of water and drench both the oxen and the firewood. Then he said, do it again, and they did it again. Then he said, do it a third time, and they did it a third time. And the altar was drenched, and the trench was filled with water. Now, as an old Boy Scout, you know how hard it is to start a fire if you're working with wet wood. Let me tell you, I have done that. Most people in the course of, these days, they'll either get out the Girl Scout water, the gasolines, or they'll get out their propane torch and try to heat it up for a while, and smoke everybody out. Anyways, verse 36, when it was time for the sacrifice to be offered, the daily sacrifice that would have been in the temple in Jerusalem, to the south at this point in time, the king of Judah, but people knew what time that was, to be offered. Elijah the prophet came up and he prayed, O God, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, make it known right now that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant, and that I'm doing what I'm doing under your orders. Answer me, God, answer me, and reveal to the people that you are God, the true God, and you are giving these people another chance at repentance. Immediately the fire of God fell and burned up the offering, the wood, the stones, the dirt, and even the water in the trench. See, this was not your ordinary little wood fire. All the people saw it happen and fell on their faces in awed worship, exclaiming, God is the true God. God is the true God. And Elijah told them, grab the Baal prophets, don't let one get away. And they grabbed them, and Elijah had them taken down to the brook Kishon, and they massacred the lot. That's the way politics was done in the ancient world. Elijah said to Ahab, up on your feet, eat and drink, celebrate. Rain is on the way. I hear it coming. Ahab did get up. He got up, ate, and drank. Meanwhile, Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, because he still needed the rain. He bowed deeply in prayer, his face between his knees, and then he said to his young servant, on your feet now, look toward the sea. He went and looked and reported back, I don't see a thing. Keep looking, said Elijah, 7 times if necessary. And sure enough, the 7th time, he said, yes, oh yes, I see a cloud, but very small, no bigger than someone's hand rising out of the sea. Quickly then, on your way. Tell Ahab, saddle up and get down from the mountain before the rain stops you. things happened fast. The sky grew black with wind-driven clouds, and then a huge cloud burst of rain, and Ahab hightailing it in his chariot for Jezreel, where his palace was, and where his queen Jezebel was hanging out. And God strengthened Elijah mightily, pulling up his robe and tying it around his waist. Remember, that's how they would move, okay? They'd gird up their loins, as it were. And Elijah ran in front of Ahab's chariots until they reached Jezreel. God had a purpose in this. He had a purpose. And it was, of course, to bring Israel back, and it did for a season. It would for a season. You know, the story isn't there. It's a little more complicated than that. Because, of course, when Ahab told Jezebel, his queen, his Sidonian queen, pagan queen, you know, everything that happened, she sent out, you know, she promised to send out a hit squad and get Elijah. and Elijah considered it a credible enough threat that he hightailed it down to cyanide and made himself scarce for a while. And he was quite discouraged. But God dealt with the discouragement. He actually, you know, you could read the whole story, and he set up a successor, and they continued to work. You know, they would work for generations to bring the people of Israel back to repentance. But of course, the end of the story was they didn't turn, not in sufficient numbers, and God would eventually destroy the government and exile the people. And even in Jesus' day, you know, how many of the people he preached to and called them to repentance, how many repented? How many turned? No, it's only a handful. You know that because, you know, at the Passover, just before, you know, at the time of his crucifixion, how many were in the upper room? Is 100, I believe it was 120. Only 120. There were thousands and thousands who heard him. But of course, when they seized Jesus and they murdered him, nailed him on the cross, most people headed for the hills because they were part of what was being called a false messianic cult, and the government, you know, it was a unified religious government from that standpoint, church-state thing, and they would be out after them. And so the church, you know, was born in an atmosphere where, you know, they were very much, you know, those who wanted to persecute them had the seats of power. And that would be the way it would be for a very long time. In fact, you could say there was only a few times in the course of history where the church would be tolerated, up till modern times. Let's go to Romans chapter 11 and verse 2. Because, of course, the Apostle Paul knew that a great deal of the Jewish community, and the leadership especially, were hostile to the idea that Jesus was a Messiah. He breaks in, and we'll break into the middle of what he's saying here in Romans 2 to make the point. Romans chapter 11, verse 2. Staying with Peterson for a moment in his message, paraphrase. Does this mean then that God is so fed up with Israel that he'll have nothing more to do with them? Well, many people, of course, who had replacement theology ideas for many years, and over the course of history, over the last 2,000 years, have said, yes, you know, the Jews are just parasites and we should kill them or persecute them or whatever it is. And that's why in the history of the Western world from the Roman Empire, it was heavily anti-Semitic. But Paul says, is God so fed up with Israel that he'll have nothing more to do with them? The answer is hardly. Remember that I, the one writing these things, am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham out of the tribe of Benjamin. You can't get much more Semitic than that. So we're not talking about repudiation. God has been too long involved with Israel, has too much invested to simply wash his hands of them. We're still having to make this point, but Paul made, you know, so many, almost 2,000 years ago. Verse 2, do you remember that time Elijah was agonizing over the same Israel and cried out in prayer, God, they murdered your prophets, they trashed your altars, I'm the only one left, and now they're after me. And do you remember God's answer? See, this is when he fled down to Sinai, afraid that, you know, afraid that Jezebel's hit squad was right on his tail, you know, ready to get him, and it had unnerved him. He was discouraged. What did God say? What was God's answer to Elijah at that point? He said, I still have 7,000 who haven't quit, 7,000 who are loyal to the finish. It's the same today, Paul's saying. There's a fiercely loyal minority still. Not many, perhaps, but probably more than you think. They're holding on, not because of what they think they're going to get out of it, but because they're convinced of God's grace and purpose in choosing them. If they were only thinking of their own immediate self-interest, they would have left long ago. And, they would have thrown in the lots with those who don't believe in God, those who, are willing to oppress God's people. Let's go to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. James, the half-brother of Jesus, same mother, different fathers. James chapter 5, verse 16, New King James Version. Confess your trespasses, your faults, to one another, and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He was a human being just like we are. And he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. To humble Ahab, to put him in a tight spot, to humble the people, to be willing to hear and to listen to something they had been ignoring for years. Verse 18, and he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. And then he says this, James makes this point, James 5, verse 19. Brethren, if any one of you wanders from the truth and someone turns him back, let him know he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. We have a responsibility, even in the course when it's should the wicked rise to power, or we're in a situation where we're not particularly in favor. We still have a responsibility for each other, to encourage each other, to preach the gospel. It's important. These are the days right now. We're in the season of Hanukkah, and I'm to preach according to the season. Preach, do, meet. What is the fit word for the season? One of the amazing things, the prophecies of the time, because it is a prophecy in Daniel. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 11, verse 30, and let's see this prophecy. It was something that took place in the past. It was a type, but there's going to be another repeat of this yet in the future, in a different way. But because this is what Jesus would say. But if we go into Daniel chapter 11 and verse 30, and Daniel here was immediately prophesying of something that would happen about a little over 200 years later, during the time of the Maccabees, because Daniel was quite a bit earlier, hundreds of years earlier than the Maccabees. For ships of Cyprus, that is, those in Roman's hand, the prophecy will come against the king of the north, who would turn out to be Antiochus Epiphanes in Syria. Therefore, he will be discouraged. He'll be angry, and turn back to Israel to carry out his rage against the Holy Covenant and to take action. So you will turn and show favoritism towards those Jews who abandon, who break the Holy Covenant with God. Daniel 11, verse 31. To make the temple in Jerusalem unclean. That is to profane the holy place, to profane, where God's, altar was. And they will stop the people from offering the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up a blasphemous object that brings destruction. It is the abomination. It was known as the abomination of desolation. You can read this. Jesus was using this abomination of desolation as a marked signpost in the ends of time, when everything hits the fan and God's people are to really take to the hills and hide, especially those in Judea. This is what they're encouraged. You can check that out on your own. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, Mark chapter 13 and verse 14. And of course, the account of how it was originally fulfilled, or what Daniel had prophesied, you can find it in the Apocrypha, which is historical, I would say, account. It is not God's word from that standpoint. It doesn't have the authority of Scripture by any means. But you can find that in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 44 to verse 47 and verse 54. Anyways, going back to Daniel chapter 11, verse 32, the king of the north will tell lies and cause those who have not obeyed God, those who are transgressing the covenant, to be ruined. That's the way the Expanded puts it. That is, to become godless, to be corrupted. These people will be corrupted. But those who know God, Daniel was the prophecy that came to him, but those who know God and obey him will be strong and fight back. They're not just going to lie down and be run over. The New Living Translation puts it, but the people who know their God will be strong and will resist him. There will be a resistance. Amplified says, but the people who are spiritually mature and know their God will display strength and take action to resist. Like any sort of action that one does, when one is speaking truth to the power, you must be wise as a serpent, and yet harmless as a dove. That is very important, because we're not to be overcome by evil, but we can't use evil methods to combat evil. Back to Daniel chapter 11, verse 33. Those who are wise, insightful among the people will help others. Help others to understand what is happening. See, this is a role of what we have, to help others to understand what is happening. But the scriptures warn, they say, but they will be killed. Literally means they will stumble with swords, or be burned, or taken captive, or sent into exile, or robbed of their homes and possessions. These things will continue for many days. And when these things come to pass, we might feel like Job. Why, how come we're not getting the justice now that, how come, the wicked aren't being judged and getting their just resorts? But again, as I said, the Amplified in this verse 3, those who are wise and have spiritual insight among the people will instruct many and help them understand. Yet for many days, some of them and their followers will fall by the sword and by the flame and by captivity and plunder. And when the wise ones are suffering, when they stumble, they will get a little help. But many who join them were cautioned. The wise ones will not help them in the time of need, because these people are going to be insincere. They're going to be hypocritical. And people's words, and when give comes to shove, some people will do anything to save their hides. Verse 36, some of the insightful ones will be killed, but the hard times must come so that they can be made stronger and pure and without faults. That is, to refine, to purify, and to cleanse them, I think is probably the New King James would put it. Until the time of the end comes, then at the right time, the end will come. God has a plan. God has a plan. Daniel, let's go on with Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. Now at that time, at that end time, Michael, the great angelic prince who stands guard over the children of people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, because the wicked will be in power, and they're going to be in power in such a way that it will be worse than, they'll be worse than Ahab. It'll be worse than Charles II. The time of distress such as has never occurred since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people, everyone who is found in the book of life, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground, in other words, they're dead, will awake. That is, they will be resurrected. These to everlasting life. But some, the insincere, the hypocrites, the evil, to disgrace and everlasting contempt or abhorrence. Those who are spiritually wise will shine brightly, like the brightness of the expanse of heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the scroll until the end of time, and many will go back and forth and search anxiously, through the scroll, searching for knowledge, the purpose of God as revealed by the prophets. This search and this desperate, what is happening will greatly increase. But we're told, go about your business. Verse 10, Daniel 12, verse 10, he concludes this section. He says, go on about your business, Daniel. See, Daniel, you've got work to do. You've got things to do. The message is confidential and under lock and key until the end of all things are about to be wrapped up. The populace will be washed clean and made like new, but the wicked will just keep on being wicked without a clue of what is happening. Those who live wisely and well will understand what's going on. So there will be a difference in understanding because we have this book. But the wicked do not have this book. They don't look at it. They don't consider it. They consider the tired old dichotomy of the struggle between evil and light, between darkness and light. They're not interested in having and listening to these things anymore. So they won't know what's going on. Apostle Paul says this. It's a warning, and he gave this in 2 Timothy, which was the last of his epistles, which was written before he had his head chopped off by Nero's minions, his executioners. 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1. Paul said this to Timothy, who's going to carry on the work for him. I can't impress this on you too strongly, Timothy. God is looking over your shoulder. Christ himself is the judge, with the final say on everyone, living and dead. He is about to break into the open with his rule. Well, Paul thought it was then. Back there in the 60s AD. But it wasn't going to be. He is about, and of course, one day with Christ is like 1,000 years. So maybe it's just a couple days from God's perspective since the time of Paul. Christ himself is a judge with the final say on everyone living and dead. He is about to break into the open with his rule. So proclaim the message with intensity. Keep on your watch. Challenge, warn, and encourage and urge your people. Don't ever quit. Just keep it simple and keep it going. We must be perseverant. We must be overcomers. The book of Revelation tells us we must overcome. We must persevere until the very end. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, you're going to find that there will be times when people will have no stomach for solid teaching, but will fill up on spiritual junk food, catchy opinions that tickle their fancy. Political correctness, we would say these days. They'll turn their backs on truth and chase mirages. But you Timothy, you servant of God, who's going to continue on, keep your eye on what you're doing, accept the hard times along with the good, keep the message alive, do a thorough job as God's servant. Paul is saying to Timothy, we must keep on keeping on. In spite of whatever hard times that may come about, whenever the wicked rise to power, we must, if we're close, if we're reading this book, we will have an understanding of what has happened. But we can't just collapse in this. There may be times that it comes to hide. There may be times when it comes to confront. We don't know. Jesus said, that we will be hauled. He promises before councils and before courts and trials. And the apostles all had this happen to them. Yet God will provide the word. And if we have faith in what the scriptures say, we'll do what's necessary. God has his way of protecting us in one of his ways or another. He has this promise to us. So we have this commission, and when we came in and were baptized, we had to count the cost. And the cost is not always fun in a society that turns away from God to be part of God's people. but the reward and the anticipation is great for when finally, when it finally comes to pass, of what the Proverbs said, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory and celebration. There will be. And of course, we know that is what the book of Revelation talks about when we come to the marriage supper of the Lamb. We want to be there. Let us remember that when the wicked rise to power, yes, there may come a time when men hide themselves, but in the meantime, we have work to do. Let us be steadfast and persevering in what we have been called to accomplish. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we're grateful